Hi, I'm Pamela from My Therapy NYC. I'm a psychotherapist there. And tonight we're having a webinar about navigating the differences in sexual desire. So thank you for joining. A few housekeeping things. There might be a several second delay on the recording, so please bear with me on that. Secondly, I invite you to fill out our poll question that I'm going to come back to at the end. And also, there's going to be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So please hold your questions till then, and I will answer as many of them as I possibly can. Great, so let's get started. Okay, so the objectives for this webinar include normalizing having different levels of sexual desire from your partner or partners, understanding the difference between the traditional and the willingness models of the sexual response cycle, gaining understanding about spontaneous versus responsive desire, and learning some tips and tools about how this information can improve someone's sex life. So I want to just make a point here that I'm using the term sex broadly for the purpose of this webinar. So I'm not only referring to penetrative or oral sex, it really can be referring to any type of sexual activity, anything that's intimate, really whatever works for that person. Also, this is inclusive for people of all genders, of all kinds of relationships. Okay, so differences in desire is normal. Let's start by thinking about our desire for food. So maybe you one day are very hungry, right? And your partner isn't hungry at all. Or maybe you're in the mood for tacos and your partner is more interested in eating pasta. This probably is not gonna cause deep distress in your relationship, right? So if we apply the same logic of our appetites to sex, we can see that this can come up and it can be really normal. And in fact, differences in desire, in sexual desire, is actually the #1 issue faced by couples. It's very normal and it's very common. Another thing that's really common is that desire can fade or change over time if you've been in a relationship for a long time. And Esther Perel has done a lot of research about this, and she has found that the part of what's going on here about this fading of desire has to do with this seeming paradox between what people want in love and what people want in desire. So love, right, you want this stability or reliability or mutuality. However, with desire, you're more interested in adventure and spontaneity. So these things can seemingly feel irreconcilable. However, there's things to work around that, but that is definitely a common phenomenon. So although we're hearing that desire or differences in sexual desire can be very common and very normal, they can still bring up really big feelings for people. And I want to share an example from my work. I'm going to be talking about a few couples that I've worked with over the past few years. And so this one couple I worked with is a gay male couple I worked with several years ago. And this is kind of what was going on for them. So they came to therapy to talk about this issue exactly. And the first partner, he was the one that was always initiating sex. And after a while, he started to get resentful that he was the one that was always taking on this role. And in addition to his resentment, he started to also have some feelings of shame come up. And what was there for him, as we explored it, these were old, deep feelings that were bringing up some things triggered from adolescence where he was feeling like, no one will ever find me attractive. My partner doesn't find me attractive. No one will ever want me. So it was very deep, this wound there. So meanwhile, his partner was feeling, it wasn't that he wasn't attracted to his partner. However, when his partner would initiate sex with him and he wasn't feeling it in the mood, he would feel a lot of pressure and kind of panic. And he would then, this was also triggering some shame for him because he was feeling like, what's wrong with me? I'm broken. Why don't I want to have sex with my partner right now? So, and this also is a feeling that he'd felt for a long time. So this cycle would continue and they would trigger each other and both would end up feeling bad. It would often end up with one or both of them in tears, and it wasn't really getting resolved in the time. So we're going to come back to this couple, but I just wanted to share kind of a way that this can show up with feelings. And then communicating about differences in desire with your partner is not always easy, even if you're in therapy. It can be really, really difficult. So back to the couple I just mentioned, they were able to communicate enough to be able to bring themselves to therapy and start exploring this, which was amazing, right? However, once they got to therapy, that wasn't immediately all they needed. In fact, when we would start to explore this, even talking about this situation that was happening in the bedroom would bring up the same feelings of shame, the same feelings of resentment. So it was deep, right? And it would get triggered by discussing it. So there's a lot there. So my main goal for this webinar is to reframe sexual desire. So my hope is that by the end, instead of seeing differences in sexual desire as a sexual problem, hopefully that instead we can view them simply as differences that can be navigated if we have the right tools. So let's take a look at the traditional model of the sexual response cycle, which was originally by Masters and Johnson, tweaked by Kaplan. So we see here, it starts with desire, and then it leads to arousal, which eventually gets to orgasm and then comes to resolution. Right? Pretty straightforward. Okay. So what do we notice as we look at this? A few things that I notice. One is that it's linear, right? This is a one direction. And also that it starts with desire. That is the beginning point of this model. And another thing is that it must include orgasm. That's an essential part of this model. So this model actually is leaving out many people. And who is it leaving out? We're going to explore that a little more, but essentially it's leaving out any person that does not experience desire before they have sex. So at this point, I want to take a few minutes to share about the different kinds of sexual desire. And I recently made a video blog all about this topic. So we're going to pause here and we're going to watch this video to learn about that. Hi, I'm Pamela. I'm a psychotherapist at My Therapy NYC. And today I'm going to talk to you about the differences between spontaneous desire and responsive desire. One of the most common issues that couples face in and out of therapy is sex. And one of the most common challenges about sex is differences in desire. Without being able to understand or communicate about these challenges, frustration and resentment can build over time. If our only source of knowledge about sex was media and porn, we might believe that spontaneous desire is the only kind there is. Two people see each other across a room, feel immediately overwhelmed with passionate desire, rip each other's clothes off, and have the best sex they've ever had. However, if we were to ask most couples if this is what their sex life actually looks like, they would say no. And some people do experience desire this way, and that's absolutely fine. However, many do not, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, a myth that is perpetuated by this type of portrayal of sex is that everyone should feel desire this way, and if you don't, then something's wrong with you. And that is simply not true. Another myth is that desire is a prerequisite for sex to happen. And again, this is totally false. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the different kinds of desire now. Spontaneous desire is the kind that I was just talking about that's portrayed in the media. It seems to come out of nowhere. Someone experiences desire at the drop of a dime, sparked by even a small thing. And many people do experience this at some point in their lives, particularly in the beginning of a relationship. And then the other kind of desire is called responsive desire. And responsive desire does not seem to come out of nowhere. Instead, this is a response to arousal. So what that means is someone might decide to engage in sexual activity, and then they get turned on. And then their desire emerges as a result of this process. Many people experience desire this way, and in fact, most women do. The same person can experience both kinds of desire at different times in their life, with different partners, or in different circumstances. So as you can see, desire does not need to be present to lead to sex. So, desire can be the spark that can lead to great sex, or it does not need to be present at first, and instead, arousal can lead to desire. So the important thing to know here is that no matter which kind of desire you experience, it is normal and it is healthy, and it can be a path to having a fulfilling sex life with your partner or partners. Learning to understand your own experience of desire and learning how to communicate that better with your partner or partners can be a really helpful tool to help navigate your own sex life. Okay, so just to revisit this, if you'd like to read it again, but this is what the video is just about. So now let's revisit the traditional model of the sexual response cycle now that we've seen that and heard about the differences between responsive and spontaneous desire. So we can see that this model, this traditional model, has no room for responsive desire, right? It just isn't there. There's no place for responsive desire to come in. And who is left out? So as we said, anyone who does not experience responsive desire, anyone who experiences responsive desire, this model just doesn't fit what is happening for them. And I want to share a bit of research which shows that 70% of men do experience spontaneous desire, while 10 to 20% of women do, and roughly 70% of women and 20 to 30% of men experience responsive desire. So I want to just kind of unpack that a little. While this was, research that included lots of people, so there's definitely validity to it for sure. I also want to say that this responsive desire and spontaneous desire can be experienced by people of all genders, and it's not always on gender lines, and any one individual can experience both kinds of desire at different points in their life, in different contexts, with different people, okay? However, I do think it's really important to note here that this traditional model is really centering the experience of male sexual desire and thereby pathologizing what is a very normal experience for most women's experience of sexual desire. And I think that's really important to note. So we needed a new model, and Rosemary Bassan came up with this model called the willingness model of sexual response cycle. So let's take a look here. It begins with motivations for sex, which another language for that is willingness for sex. Then with sexual stimuli, taking into account context and where people's mind is at, that can lead to sexual arousal. And on this model, it's noted that arousal is both physiological in the body, but it's also it happens in your mind too, and that's important. And then comes responsive desire. So that's like the fifth step in this model, as opposed to the first step in the other model. And then it leads to satisfaction. And we see here spontaneous desire is there in the middle, and it could come in at any point, including the beginning, but it could come in at any point. So what do we notice about this model? So for one, it's not linear, right? This is like a circular model. Secondly, it does not need to start with desire. It can start with willingness, but it can start with desire. So that's absolutely an option, but it's not a necessity. As you see here, desire can follow arousal. And then another thing to note is that it ends with satisfaction. And that might include orgasm, but it might not include orgasm. So it could also, it's more inclusive because it's not true that every single person sex ends with orgasm or that they're even seeking that. So satisfaction might mean pleasure to someone, or it might mean a feeling of connectedness or intimacy, or it could mean orgasm. So how does all this information help someone's sex life? So a few things I want to note here. So one, just learning that responsive desire is a thing and that exists and is normal can be incredibly empowering and boost someone's sexual self-confidence. And I want to come back to the couple that I mentioned earlier, because through our work in therapy, at some point I brought in these ideas and I shared with them about responsive desire and spontaneous desire and what those look like and the willingness model. And that was a game changer for this couple. And the way that impacted them was, for the second partner, the one who was feeling shame that he wasn't feeling interested in sex when his partner initiated it right away and would just immediately shut down and feel broken, like I just don't feel this. For him, learning that responsive desire was a possibility, it was like another path to sex for him, right? So when his partner would initiate, instead of immediately being like, no, something's wrong with me, instead, there was a new story that was existent, that came to be here, right? So the new story was, maybe I'm interested, but I'm not interested right now, but that doesn't mean that I can't get there. So he would check in with himself and be like, okay, well, am I willing? Am I willing to try to get aroused, and then maybe I'll feel desire. And sometimes the answer was still no, which is totally fine. But sometimes the answer was yes. And when the answer was yes, there was some space and there was some possibility to get him in the mood. And then if he did get in the mood, they would be able to enjoy sex together. And then neither of them, it was kind of interrupting this shame cycle that had been happening. And then for his partner, the one who was always initiating sex, it really changed it for him too, because it changed his story. His story had been, my partner's rejecting me. He says no all the time. He must find me hideous. But instead, now his story could be, okay, my partner experiences responsive desire, so he's not there yet. So let's see if we can get there. And then when he did, he's like feeling connected and feeling that his partner did have desire for him. Okay, so the second point I wanted to make is that simply having this conceptual framework and this new language can really open up communication between partners about their sex life. I want to share an example from another couple I worked with in the past, and this was a straight couple. So for them, they'd been together for many years, and they came to therapy for, to talk about a bunch of things, but we did end up exploring sex a bit. And so for them, in the beginning of their relationship, they had spontaneous sex all the time, and it was great. However, that has kind of changed over time, and now, or when I was seeing them in the present in therapy, they were sharing that they still had regular sex, and when they did, they enjoyed it. However, it was never spontaneous; it was always planned. So, as we explored this in therapy, so one of the partners, the man in the relationship, he enjoyed the sex they were having, but he was feeling really embarrassed and just kind of disappointed that their sex was not spontaneous. And he had this story that if your relationship is good, then you're still having spontaneous sex all the time. And what's wrong with us that that's not happening? And he had this assumption that everyone else must be doing that. Meanwhile, his wife really liked the arrangement. And she didn't have this language yet, but she was someone who experienced responsive desire. So for her, scheduling sex was really great because then there wasn't this pressure to be ready at any moment. She knew it was coming and could kind of mentally prepare and then get excited, and she enjoyed it. However, it did bring up some anxiety for her and some guilt because she knew that her partner wasn't totally satisfied with how it was going. So in therapy, we did talk about this framework, and I shared the graph with him, right? And it felt very theoretical, but it was incredibly useful for them. And this was a big shift. So learning about this, it really normalized their experience, and it really normalized both the kind of desire that they were experiencing, specifically the woman in the relationship, but also it was really affirming to hear that this was totally okay and there was nothing wrong with them. And in fact, many people do not have spontaneous sex over a long-term relationship. And as they learned that while they didn't have the language for it or didn't yet really know this, they were kind of using some really great strategies to keep their sex life in a good place. So when they first started talking about this topic, their goal was to change their behavior and get more spontaneous, spice up their sex life, right? But as we explored this, their goal no longer became to change their behavior. It just reframed the whole thing, and now they felt totally fine about how their sex life was going. And in fact, they were like, we're doing great. This feels good. It just changed how they saw it. And this, again, it changed the story. So it changed how they felt about it. So third, if both or all partners are willing and you can decide to have sex, right? So you don't need to wait until both people are spontaneously in the mood. And that's really useful to know because for some couples, actually, that happens often and it's no problem. But if that's not happening in someone's relationship, knowing that you can rely on willingness can really enhance things. Okay, so we're going to talk about some tips and tools. So the first one is getting to know yourself and what turns you on. So if you are someone who experiences responsive desire specifically, we now know that it doesn't mean you necessarily have low desire, which might have been kind of a label you've internalized. It might not mean that. It might just mean you have responsive desire. So you get turned on in response to something. So it's important to find out all the things that your desire responds to. And if you're someone who's told themselves or been told by others that you just have low desire, you might not have invested that much time in trying to find out what turns you on. So now this is a good opportunity to kind of reframe that for yourself. And it's great to share that with your partners. The second one is making a sexual menu. So what that is it's making a list of all the sexual or sensual things that you might enjoy. And just, you don't have to think that hard. You don't have to censor yourself. Just go for it, right? Include anything on there. And they do not all need to be sexual acts. They can be things that get you turned on or make you feel romantic or make you feel connected. So they could include sexual acts, but they could also include things like a walk on the beach or a massage or watching a movie in the dark. It really can be very personal to every person. So the idea here would be every person would write their own menu and then you'd share it. If you're working with a therapist, this could be something you would do in therapy and then share it in a session. But if you're not, that's totally fine. You can do it alone and share it with each other. And then once you've shared the menus with each other, you can make a joint menu for like as your relationship. And both people have veto power, right? We're all people. So if there's something on there that one person's really into, but someone else is like, definitely not, then it's not going on the combined menu, sorry. You can include things that only you want, or you can also include things that are maybes for you or things that you definitely don't want. And that's also an opportunity to really explore where your boundaries are and asserting them and naming them. So, this can be fun, and this can be something, sometimes if people think they're having low desire, they're just a little bit bored. So this can be a way to kind of explore some new ideas and things you'd like to try, especially for the people that might have been in a relationship for a long time and are feeling their desire fading a little. You can make a now menu and a future menu. So the now menu would be things you want right now that you're comfortable with. And a future menu might be things that you're like, I'm not there. I don't think I want to do that, but maybe one day I would. I'm like interested in that. So kind of like bookmark that. And then one more thing I want to say is including some side-by-side things and some face-to-face things. And what I mean by that, side-by-side things are things that you can do together, but they're not towards each other. For example, reading erotica out loud to each other or watching porn together. And some face-to-face things would be things that you are doing kind of towards each other. So that might be sharing what your fantasies are with the other person or role-playing, for example. So here's an example of someone's sexual menu. As you see, they list things they're into and things they're curious about and things that they're definitely not into, right? And as you see, there's some explicit sexual acts on here, and then there's some things that are more just like romantic or things about sensuality. And I want to share a variation of a sexual menu, which is called a yes, no, maybe list. So it's the same concept as the sexual menu. However, instead of generating all the ideas yourself, you're starting with a list of a ton of different things. I realize that the font is very small on this. I'm not sure if you can see it. But then you're taking this list and then you're thinking to yourself and you're checking off what are your yeses, nos, and maybes. And if you Google this, you'll find many examples. So it's definitely easy to find if this is something you'd like to try. Okay, so the next tip is to schedule a sex date. And again, I just want to reiterate here that by sex, I don't mean that on this date you are committing to having sex, right? Again, sex can mean anything you want it to mean. It could really, the purpose of this tip is to be creating an intentional time when you are going to make space to be with your partner in a sexual or in a sensual way and create intimacy, right? So you're just like blocking out time for that. And it could be something, it could be that you're gonna be like, let's give each other a massage. Or it could be, let's try this kinky thing on the yes, no, maybe list that we've never tried and we want to, or anything in between. But the important thing is that you agree to a time when this will be, and that you both, make space for it. And again, I do want to say that since it's in the future, people get to change their mind. We always get to change our mind. But the idea here is that this is based on the idea of the willingness model, that you don't need to be starting from a place of desire, that you can be willing, and then you can get there through creating arousal, right? So, and maybe some people are sitting there thinking, wow, that's like the least sexy idea I've ever heard, is to schedule sex. And some people do have that reaction. And I want to share that many couples that I've worked with have found this to be really great and like really helpful. And some people find it awkward at first, and other people don't at all, but often people find it to be ultimately incredibly useful. And it can be fun. You can like get into it. You can like text leading up to it or get excited or like know it's coming. So yeah. The fourth one is creating space. And what I mean by this here is, again, coming back to Esther Perel's research. And she found, after interviewing many, many people in many countries about their experience of desire in relationships, is that people are most drawn to their partner when there's some space. So that might mean when their partner's away, or when their partner just returns after being away, or when they're doing something where they're totally independent or in their element and you're kind of observing them from afar. So for example, if your partner is a comedian and you're watching them do a stand-up routine on stage, they're not talking to you, but you're like watching them do this thing they're really great at. That can really kind of cause someone to feel more attracted. And she used this quote that I want to share. She was like, "A fire needs air." And I thought that was very apt here, especially if you've been together for a long time. And then the last tip I want to share is couples therapy or sex therapy. So as we mentioned earlier, communicating about sex can be incredibly difficult. In our society, it's very taboo and stigmatized to do that. We're not supposed to have problems. We're supposed to just figure it out, and it's great. So there's not a lot of room or models about how to talk about what's not going well or what is hard or places we feel stuck. So having a therapist to support you doing that can be incredibly useful, to just have someone else in there facilitating this conversation that might be incredibly difficult and offer some tips and some strategies that could really help. Okay, so we're going to come to our poll and see what the results are. Great, so, okay, I'm going to read the poll question again. So the question is, what is your greatest obstacle to having satisfying sex with your partners? So according to our poll, thank you so much for participating in this. 15% of people reported that I'm often not in the mood for sex. So that to me, like I'm thinking, okay, that might have to do with the responsive versus spontaneous desire issue. So the winning answer is the second one. My partner and I don't want sex at the same time, which is 46% of people replied that was the one. And again, I think this speaks to like differences in desire, perhaps spontaneous and versus responsive desire, or just different times when someone's having spontaneous desire. So this seems like very relevant to what we're talking about the willingness model and to communicating about when and how you can meet those needs together. 23% of people said my partner wants more or less sex than I do, which I think I haven't spoken to so directly in this webinar, but I think this does also relate to just communicating, which is like, again, really challenging around sex, but I think that is what that one's about, okay? 8% of people said my partner doesn't know what I like. So I'm wondering if for those people, they might want to try something like the sexual menu or a yes, no, maybe list to kind of like spark talking about some communication about what you like and don't like. And then 8% of people said my partner and I aren't as attracted to each other as we used to be. So again, that kind of speaks to the phenomenon of desire fading over time. And again, this might be a great place to try something like a sexual menu or creating some space. Thank you for doing the poll. It's really interesting. Okay, so now I want to open up for some questions that I will do my best to answer. Okay. So I'm seeing a question. Thank you for writing this question. This person wrote, can someone with spontaneous desire really be compatible with someone with responsive desire? Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. And while it might take more communicating than if both people had spontaneous desire, they absolutely can. And I've seen this in my practice over and over again. And I think the more you can talk about it and the more you can name that that's, well, before naming, even just acknowledging and understanding your own experience of desire and then communicating that with your partner, the more compatible you can be and the more ways you need to work, the less ways you need to work around it, and instead you can just navigate those differences. And I think I do want to acknowledge that some partners who have spontaneous desire might feel frustrated at first, especially, or disappointed that their partner also doesn't have spontaneous desire. And that is also totally a valid way to feel, and you get to kind of like grieve the loss of that kind of sexual relationship if that's what you imagined. You get to have that process. And then you can like reset and decide like, okay, this is not how I imagined it, but this can also be a really great sexual relationship with my partner. Okay. Another question I'm seeing, thank you for this question, is how can I overcome feeling sexually rejected by my partner? Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And feeling sexually rejected is something that can come up a lot for people, especially when there's someone who's initiating sex and the other person is not interested at the time. That can feel like a rejection. So again, I think this really speaks to understanding how your partner experiences desire. And instead of assuming that it's a rejection of you, instead there's an opportunity to like reframe that and understanding what that person is feeling. And it might be that they're not feeling desire yet, but they could. And that really, I mean, that question really comes up to me around the couple I shared about in this webinar, how one of them was feeling incredibly rejected, actually. And then through exploring it and working on it, that feeling of rejection changed to kind of like empathy and understanding where his partner was coming from, and then learning a new way to experience his desire and like noticing it. Okay. This question says, if both partners are very shy, how can they begin talking about sex? Yeah, good question. So I guess two things come to mind for that one. One is, I think couples therapy can be incredibly helpful, right? If you can communicate enough to get yourself to couples therapy, which I recognize that in itself might be a big challenge. But if you're able to do that, if you're able to communicate that we need help, we feel stuck, even if you can't talk about it beyond that, I think a therapist can be incredibly helpful in just like holding that space and being the one to initiate conversations and kind of supporting both people and going slowly and helping people go there, right? Another thought that comes to mind is if it feels like too much to talk about your own experience of sex or your own sex life, then maybe just kind of exposing yourself to sexuality in other ways together. Like those kind of like on the sexual menu, the idea of side-by-side things. So perhaps you read erotica together. So you're just kind of like getting more comfortable with sex being talked about around you together, right? So you don't have to talk about yourself or reading things together or watching things together. So it's just present, or reading blogs or other things like that. So that's what comes to mind on that one for me. Thank you for that question. Okay. I'm seeing, okay. Someone's asking, how do you best navigate the shame associated with this topic that comes up? Yeah, it's a great question because shame is triggered very often with this topic. And I think, I mean, I can speak to my experience working with people in therapy around the shame. There's absolutely ways that people can address this, not in therapy, I'm not saying. The only way is by getting a therapist. However, I think there's a unique opportunity in therapy to really explore this shame, right? Because often when shame is triggered, it's bringing up old feelings, and it's not just about the current moment. So having an opportunity to kind of like explore the depth of that can be really valuable. And I think it's really important to work really slowly around shame because it can be very powerful and it can lead to shutting down very quickly. So it's certainly not something that you want to like overwhelm someone with, but just noticing when shame comes up, I think is a really helpful way to address that work. Like I'll say when I'm working with clients and I notice shame come up, I don't dig into that and, overwhelm someone with it, or I try not to. I try to acknowledge that shame and like notice it. And like, we sometimes will pause there and notice that that's a point to kind of like back away for now and then come back to. It's very sensitive. So it's really important to kind of like honor that so we're not having people shutting down. And slowly but surely, where that kind of line is that people are able to go to can really shift. And I think kind of having that process with your partner in therapy can be incredibly powerful, and noticing where it comes up. So again, specifically, I feel like maybe a broken record, but I do think it's really relevant here that a lot of shame comes up around people's stories and their narratives about themselves. Like there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, I'm never going to be like everyone else. And with a little education about differences in desire and willingness, I think that some of that shame really can transform and shift if you're understanding it differently. And if your story can change, you really can kind of alleviate some of that shame and clear yourself up to have a new story about your own desire. Okay, well, thank you so much to everyone who asked questions. I really appreciate that. If you think of any questions later on, feel free to email me. So I want to share some resources. And this page, in addition to a copy of this video, are going to be emailed to you in the next few days. So you can have this resource list. I think there's some really great stuff on here. So I would encourage you to check them out. And yeah, I want to really thank everyone for participating in this webinar. And again, I work at My Therapy NYC, which is a counseling and wellness practice in the Flatiron neighborhood of New York. So if you were ever interested in booking a session here with any of our therapists for individual or couples therapy, please feel free to reach out. Here's our contact information. Thank you so much and have a good night.